Between the conflict of Palestine and Israel, these 3 paragraphs are a brief overview. It was written on November 2nd, 1917, by Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur in the name of Walter Rothschild, the headliner of a British community. The letter that was written in this letter created a dispute. This dispute will continue for the next 100 years. Perhaps even the British government did not anticipate it. Who is wrong between Israel and Palestine? What is the source of the dispute between these two, and what role does the British government play in all of this? Now, this topic is one of the most controversial topics in the world, and my complete effort will be to talk only in terms of facts and figures, so that no one can object. Before World War I, there was no kind of conflict in Palestine. There was a greater population of Muslims here, but Jews and Christians also lived happily with them. At that time, this entire area was under Ottoman Empire's control. Looking at this map, it can be seen that the Ottoman Empire had a significant presence from Europe to Africa and the Middle East. Some Arab leaders were quite dissatisfied with the role of the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to free themselves from here, and to achieve this goal, they secretly met with Britishers, who were the enemies of the Ottoman Empire. Britishers promised them that if they helped against the Ottoman Empire, an independent country would be given to them. Such a promise was also made to the Jews in Europe. Jews were always a community with no fixed place in the world. That is, they had no country of their own wherever they lived. Jews were facing difficulties from the beginning. They were viewed with hatred, and many times they were killed for various reasons. But why was this the case? The reason behind this is religious conflict. For centuries, Christians believed that they were the ones responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. It was precisely because of this main conflict that Jews were not tolerated in Europe. The worldwide network of the first Jewish community, as strong as it is today, was built around this conflict. Even earlier, there was a significant Jewish population. The movement to establish a separate homeland in Palestine was called Zionism. This movement began in 1896 and was led by a Jewish political activist named Theodor Herzl. He wrote a book, the English translation of which is The Jewish State. In it, he wrote that if Jews in your Europe want to lead a peaceful life, they must create their own country in Palestine. Initially, many Jews were against this concept. They argued that they shouldn't leave their country because of hatred against Jews. But this movement quickly transformed into a political form. Jews worldwide began to turn to Palestine, and funds were raised from within their own community. They were given money to establish businesses and factories there. The British government had promised them, meaning the European Jews, that they would be given the opportunity to create their own country in Palestine. Let's move forward. In 1917, during the World War I, in which the Ottoman Empire was suffering significant losses. On November 2nd, 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour and Paul Fore of the British Jewish community wrote a letter to the head of the Jewish community, Walter Rothschild. In this letter, it was stated that the British government had decided that Jews could come and create their own country in Palestine. Rothschild was assured that the British government would fully support this work. Additionally, it was written that this would not harm the Muslim schools already present there. Just 1 month after writing the letter, British soldiers arrived and seized Palestine, ending a 400-year-old Ottoman rule. The question is, what did the Jews want in return for giving them their own separate country? In reality, the British only wanted one thing, that after the Ottoman Empire left, there would be a state here that could support them in the future, their ally. Therefore, they had promised the Jews a separate country, but in return, they had also taken a promise from the Jews that after creating their own separate country, they would not abandon the British. What used to happen was that the country that won the war would often seize the next country and establish its rule there, until they became independent. In World War I, Palestine came under British control. They made significant efforts to create a colony there and ultimately succeeded. But the Palestinians who already lived in Palestine believed that Britain never asked them about their independence. In 1919, Balfour wrote a memorandum that stated that there was no need to inquire about the wishes of those who were already living in Palestine. In the eyes of the British government, the law they had created for the Jews in Palestine was quite lenient. The influx of Jewish immigrants from around the world began in Palestine. They built their schools there, opened factories, and even formed a small army under British supervision, which was called the Haganah. In other words, Palestine had no option other than to do what the British told them to do, except to think that the British were not working for our independence, but were actually giving our land to others. They tolerated this for a few years, but in 1939, they began to rise against it. However, the meaning of raising their voice in front of the British was one and only one. Palestine was severely punished for making this noise. Many were arrested. Some leaders were expelled from Palestine, and some were hanged. However, Palestine did not end its strike even after this. In response, the British government established a commission to resolve the matter. The commission suggested that Palestine should be divided into two parts. However, Palestine did not accept this solution because in reality, there was unrest. In fact, there was unrest, and the reason behind this was that arrests were already taking place. Why was Palestine being divided? Their strike continued until 1939, when the British government released its white paper. In this white paper, the British government published a policy taking into account the situation in Palestine over the past 20 years. First of all, they rejected the Peel Commission, which had ended the Arab strike. Additionally, they imposed restrictions on new arrivals in Palestine and even prevented Jews who were there in the old style from buying Arab land. It was also decided that within the next 10 years, Palestine should become an independent state for both Jews and Arabs. For the Zionists, this white paper was no less than a betrayal. The white paper created a split among British Jews, with some rejecting it and many others accepting it. They launched attacks across all of Palestine, which lasted for several months, but something bigger was on the horizon that caught everyone's attention. In 1939, World War II began, where the war claimed the lives of approximately 60 million people worldwide. At the same time, Hitler callously murdered 6 million European Jews in his death camps, an event known as the Holocaust, which occurred between 1941 and 1945. Among the Jews living in Europe, 66% were killed by Hitler. For those Jews who survived, aside from going to Palestine, there were no other options. Palestine was a desirable place for them, and as there was an established community there, they began migrating despite immigration limits imposed by the British. However, conditions in Palestine were not favorable. The inhabitants were already engaged in anti-British immigration protests. Following the exhaustion of World War II, the British no longer had the stamina to fight against the opposition in Palestine. Therefore, in 1947, they decided to withdraw and handed the Palestine issue over to the United Nations. What do you think is the solution to this problem now? At that time, the Jewish population in Palestine was around 630,000, while there were approximately 143,000 Christians and 1,181,000 Muslims. These figures were part of an Italian demographer's report. If we look at it, the Muslim population was clearly more than double that of the Jews. However, the United Nations proposed a partition plan for Palestine that allocated 55% of the land to the Jewish population. In the United Nations General Assembly, this proposal received 72% of the votes and was approved. The question remains as to why only 30% of the Jewish population received 55% of the land. The United Nations never provided a satisfactory explanation for this. India, which was part of the United Nations at that time, voted against this decision. India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had raised objections to the UN decision and stated that India had been offered a bribe by the Zionists to vote in their favor. However, all Arab countries rejected the UN resolution, and the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians began. Both sides started to wage war against each other. However, back then, the real military strength of Israel was such that the Arabs were unable to effectively confront them. In 1948, David Ben-Gurion officially announced the establishment of the State of Israel. He had already become Israel's first prime minister. In 1948, all Arab countries collectively decided to call Israel, mainly because they had voted against it in the United Nations. Secondly, they saw this as a new British tactic. The first Arab-Israeli war, in which 5 Arab countries attacked a relatively new Israel, had taken place just a few months ago. However, Israel gained the support of Western countries and, in reality, was strong enough to defeat the 5 Arab countries on its own. After the war ended, the United Nations had chosen areas for Palestine, which now were also occupied by Israel. This railway has taken control over them, including the West Bank and Gaza. In 1967, another Arab-Israeli war occurred, during which Israel not only captured the West Bank, but also the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. In the midst of all this, the people of Palestine want to establish their own state. With this goal in mind, they have created their own organization, known as the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. Initially, they resorted to taking up arms and made forceful attempts to establish their own identity. They also hijacked several planes and ships to voice their demands. This is why the United States and Israel considered the PLO a terrorist organization, and many countries did not consider these people as terrorist organizations. They simply didn't understand those who wanted to establish their own nation. In 1974, these people were officially recognized by the United Nations. The representatives of the Palestinian people are recognized in this regard. In 1979, Egypt and Israel successfully conducted peace negotiations, becoming the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. In return, Israel returned the Sinai to them. However, Egypt's prime minister was assassinated by extremist groups 2 years later. Despite this setback, neither party gave up on negotiating with Israel. During this time, due to the occupation of the West Bank for so long, many Jews there began to build their own homes. However, the international community objected because the West Bank area was actually designated for Palestine in the 1947 United Nations plan. Israel also extended its control there and began to settle its people. In 1992, Israel and the PLO were at odds again. The PLO leader, Yasser Arafat, recognized Israel, as did the Israeli Prime Minister. They also recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, as not being a terrorist organization. During this period, the PLO split as well. The faction that did not want any negotiations with Israel became what we know today as Hamas. On the Israeli side, an extremist group opposed their prime minister. They insisted that there should be no compromise with Palestine, but this had no significant impact on the peace talk. Now, both sides were trying to come to terms and resolve this issue for the first time. However, the problem was that already many Israelis had built their homes in the West Bank with the approval of the Israeli government. So the solution proposed was to divide the West Bank into 3 parts: Area A, B, and C. Area A would be under Palestinian control, while Area B would be under both or neither, and Area C would be under Israeli control. In 1947, the United Nations plan did not address this situation well. Only selected pieces of the West Bank were accounted for, where they could govern themselves. This was accepted, but then, in 1995, something happened that turned everything upside down. The extreme group within Israel assassinated their own prime minister. They didn't want any Palestinians to settle around the West Bank, no matter the cost. In 1996, the first actions in Palestine led to the establishment of the first Palestinian government. But Hamas, what we know as Palestine militant wing, isn't happy with this situation. He would boycott elections, and not only that, he also encouraged several suicide forces in Israel. This further escalated the hatred between Israelis and Palestinians. Following this, the glaciers of these two sides continued to collide. To prevent this, Israel built concrete walls around its settlements in the West Bank, making it even more challenging for Palestine to survive. Then, in 2006, elections were held in Palestine, and this time, Hamas emerged victorious. This caused a rift between Fatah and Hamas, leading to a division of Palestine into two parts. Today, Hamas controls the Gaza Strip, while the West Bank is divided into smaller regions. As a result, the people there face many challenges. Most of the keys for Israel and Hamas are in these specific regions, which are targeted by rocket fire. This conflict has given rise to considerable resentment, and the right thing to do is communicate it to them through these rockets. For this reason, this topic has garnered considerable attention and support. Every 2 to 3 years, the housing situation and Israel's apprehensions prepare for another confrontation. The last time this happened was in 2021, and on October 7th, 2023, Hamas fired over 5,000 rockets at Israel. I've already covered this recent conflict in a dedicated video. Make sure to watch that video by clicking the link in the description. This summarizes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has evolved in different forms over the past 100 years and continues to define their existence. I've covered this topic in depth, using figures without targeting any religion. What are your thoughts on this topic? Please let me know in the comments section. By this mean goodbye, see you in the next fascinating video.